Racist passenger tries to have black woman removed, freezes when she flashes her FBI badge. Maya Johnson was utterly drained, the kind of exhaustion that seeps into your bones, weighing down every movement. For the past 3 weeks, she had been chasing a human trafficking ring, tirelessly tracking their operations across 4 different states. Now, with the case finally closed, she had granted herself a rare indulgence, a first-class seat on this red-eye flight from Seattle to Atlanta. All she craved was 6 uninterrupted hours of sleep, the kind that could erase the fatigue clinging to her like a second skin. But fate had other ideas. "Excuse me, I believe you're in my seat." Lifting her weary gaze, Maya found herself staring into the stern face of a middle-aged white man dressed in a crisp, expensive suit. His expression was one of thinly veiled disapproval, his lips pressed into a firm line. Slowly, she glanced down at her boarding pass before looking back up at him. 15A, she stated, her voice level despite her exhaustion. "This is my seat." The man, whose name, as she would later learn, was Richard Whitfield, narrowed his eyes, scrutinizing her from head to toe. His gaze lingered on her black hoodie, faded jeans, and natural curls pulled back into a neat ponytail. His frown deepened. "There must be some mistake," he insisted, an air of entitlement seeping into his tone. "I always book first class on this route." At that moment, Maya had no way of knowing that this simple interaction, this minor inconvenience, would soon spiral into a confrontation that would shift the course of multiple lives. She couldn't have foreseen that, before this plane touched down in Atlanta, secrets would be exposed, reputations shattered, and blood spilled. What began as an argument over a seat assignment would soon unravel something far more sinister than a mere clash of egos. But for now, it was just her, a stubborn man, and a number printed on a boarding pass. Maya remained calm. "Sir, I can assure you, this is my seat." To emphasize her point, she held up her ticket once again. Richard's face turned a shade of red that started at his neck and climbed its way up to his hairline, an unmistakable sign of a man unaccustomed to being challenged. His lips parted as though he wanted to argue further, but instead, he turned sharply and snapped his fingers at a passing flight attendant. The young woman, Amber Chin, had only been with the airline for 6 months. Still, she approached with a practiced, professional smile. "How can I assist you, sir?" Richard didn't even glance at her. "There's been a seating error. This woman is in my seat." His voice carried an air of finality, as though the very notion of being incorrect was unthinkable. Amber remained composed. "Of course, sir. May I see both of your boarding passes?" Maya handed hers over without hesitation. Richard, on the other hand, made a dramatic show of patting down his pockets before finally producing his own. Amber studied both tickets, then pointed at Richard's. "Sir, your seat is actually 15B, the aisle seat. The window seat, 15A, belongs to this passenger." A moment of silence stretched between them. Then, Richard's face darkened. "That's impossible. I always request a window seat. I always get a window seat." His voice had risen just enough to attract the attention of nearby passengers. Amber remained unfazed. "I understand, sir. However, according to our records, this is your assigned seat. The flight is nearly full, but I can check if there are any other available window seats." Maya exhaled slowly. This was the last thing she needed. The idea of spending 6 hours beside a man who already viewed her presence as an intrusion was far from ideal. She met Richard's gaze directly. "Is there a problem with my sitting here?" she asked, her tone neutral yet pointed. Richard sputtered. I didn't say that. I just prefer the window. I'm a frequent flyer. Platinum status." Amber's polite smile never wavered. "I understand, sir. However, as it stands, 15B is your assigned seat. Would you like assistance with your carry-on?" Realizing he had lost, Richard huffed and finally stowed his expensive luggage. As he sank into 15B, he made a dramatic show of wiping down the armrest between them with a sanitizing wipe. Maya ignored him, turning her focus to the book in her hands, a biography of Shirley Chisholm, a read she had been meaning to finish for months. Now that Alejandro Vargas was behind bars and 38 young women had been rescued, she could finally breathe, if only for a moment. Richard's voice broke the silence. That's quite a heavy choice for in-flight reading. Maya glanced up, caught off guard that he was speaking to her. Excuse me? The book, he clarified. Wouldn't you prefer something lighter? A romance novel, perhaps? His condescending tone was impossible to miss. Maya had met plenty of men like Richard before, men who carried their privilege like a crown, expecting the world to bend to their will. She remained unfazed. I find inspiration in stories of those who defy the odds, she replied coolly. Especially women who refuse to be defined by the limitations others place on them. Richard shifted uncomfortably. Well, he muttered, we all have our interests, I suppose. As the plane finished boarding, Amber began the safety demonstration. Maya noticed Richard's eyes lingering on the young flight attendant, his gaze following her movements with a little too much interest. Her instincts prickled. Frequent flyer? She asked casually. Richard straightened. Every week for the past 20 years. I work in medical equipment sales, clients all over the country. Must be exhausting, Maya noted. Worth it, Richard said with a self-satisfied smile. My wife never has to worry about a thing. His eyes flicked to the simple gold band on Maya's finger. What about your husband? What does he do? Maya twisted the ring that had once belonged to her grandmother. I'm not married. This was hers. She raised me after my parents died. She always told me it was a reminder. I come from a line of strong women who survived far worse than anything the world could throw at me. For a brief moment, Richard's expression softened, almost as if he might say something sympathetic. But just as quickly, his usual demeanor returned. I see. And what brings you to Atlanta? Work, Maya replied simply, offering no further details. Years in the bureau had taught her discretion, especially with men who had already made their prejudices clear. Teaching? Richard guessed, his voice carrying the assumption that teaching was the only professional path he could imagine for her. Before Maya could respond, a commotion erupted a few rows behind them. I'm not sitting next to him. This is unacceptable. Maya turned to see an elderly white woman, her face twisted with disgust, pointing at a young Middle Eastern man struggling to stow his carry-on. And just like that, the night had taken another turn. Racist passenger tries to remove black woman, freezes when she flashes her FBI badge. Compartment, ma'am. Please lower your voice. A flight attendant, his name tag reading Marcus, spoke firmly yet professionally. But the elderly woman in 14C had no intention of quieting down. Her voice, sharp and cutting, carried easily through the cabin. Do you even know what his people did to our country? She hissed, her tone laced with venom. A tense silence followed. The young man she was pointing at, who looked no older than 20, stood frozen in place, his face flushed with humiliation. He swallowed hard, staring down at the floor as though willing himself to disappear. I was born in Michigan, he murmured, his voice barely audible over the low murmur of onlookers. I'm a second-year medical student. From beside Maya, Richard leaned in slightly, lowering his voice as if sharing a confidential observation. This kind of thing, he muttered, shaking his head, is exactly why I drive whenever possible. Air travel just isn't what it used to be. Maya turned her gaze to him, her eyes narrowing. And what exactly do you mean by that? Richard seemed oblivious to the edge in her tone. Just that standards have slipped. There was a time when flying was a civilized experience. Now, with these discount fares, just anyone can board. Maya's expression remained neutral, but the weight of his words settled between them like a lead brick. Just anyone, she repeated, her voice measured. Before Richard could dig himself any deeper, Amber, the first-class flight attendant, approached the unfolding scene behind them. Ma'am, if you're uncomfortable, I can check for any available seats, Amber offered smoothly. But I assure you, all passengers on this flight have been properly screened. The woman scoffed. I don't care about your screening. I know what I see. The young man's shoulders tensed. His voice was quiet but firm. If it would make things easier, I don't mind switching seats with someone. Before Maya had even fully processed what she was doing, she was on her feet. "I'll switch," she called out. Beside her, Richard blinked. "You're leaving?" Maya picked up her book and carried on. "It seems my presence has been just as unsettling for you," she said coolly. "So yes, I'll offer this young man my seat. You can finally enjoy your window view after all." As she stepped past Richard, he reached out, his fingers lightly gripping her wrist. A brief, presumptuous touch. A flicker of irritation flared through her. "I never said I had a problem with you," he said, his confusion seeming almost genuine. Maya removed his hand with a firm, practiced ease, causing his eyes to widen slightly. "You didn't have to say it," she replied simply before walking away. At the back of first class, Marcus was still attempting to de-escalate the situation. The elderly woman, her conference badge identifying her as Elaine Bishop, was growing more agitated by the second. Maya approached calmly. "I'd be happy to exchange seats," she told Marcus. "I was in 15A. The young man, Taramati, looked up at her, gratitude in his eyes. "You don't have to do that. I don't want to inconvenience anyone." "It's no inconvenience," Maya assured him. "I'm Maya Johnson." "Taramati," he introduced himself, shaking her hand before making his way toward first class. Elaine Bishop continued to mutter under her breath, clearly displeased, but the immediate crisis was defused. As Maya settled into her new seat beside the still fuming woman, Elaine wasted no time. "They should have warned me," she grumbled, her voice low but dripping with resentment. "I'm a nervous flyer as it is, and to be seated next to, well, you understand." Maya's lips curved into a pleasant smile. "Actually, I don't. Would you care to explain exactly what about that young medical student frightened you?" Elaine blinked rapidly, clearly caught off guard. "Well, I mean, you know his background," she stammered. Maya raised an eyebrow. "His Michigan background?" Elaine scoffed. "Don't be obtuse." Maya leaned in slightly, lowering her voice just enough to make Elaine listen carefully. "I want to be absolutely clear about what you're implying, Miss Bishop. Because from where I sit, it sounds like you're making assumptions about someone's character based purely on their perceived ethnicity. And that kind of thinking? It tends to lead to some very problematic places." Elaine's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "Who do you think you are to speak to me like this? I'm 73 years old." Maya's gaze didn't waver. "Age doesn't exempt anyone from basic human decency," she said smoothly, "or from the consequences of their actions." Before Elaine could respond, the plane began taxiing, forcing a momentary pause in their conversation. As the flight attendants moved through the cabin for final checks, Maya's eyes flickered toward first class. Richard was now comfortably settled in his coveted window seat, but something about his posture felt uneasy. His gaze kept drifting back toward Coach, an unreadable expression crossing his face. Little did he know, the real drama was still to come. A tangled web of deception. A truth buried under years of secrets. And, lurking 30,000 feet below them in the darkness, a killer waiting for Flight UA 336 to land. 2 hours later, most of the cabin had settled into the quiet rhythms of overnight travel. The dim glow of seat lights illuminated the occasional reader, while the gentle hum of the engines provided a soothing white noise for those attempting to sleep. Maya had managed to doze off despite Elaine's occasional disapproving glances. But she awoke to the sound of urgent whispers. Up ahead, Marcus was leaning over an elderly man 3 rows away, his expression tense. "Sir? Sir, can you hear me?" He gave the man's shoulder a gentle shake. Maya's instincts flared to life. She unfastened her seatbelt and moved toward them. "Is everything all right?" she asked quietly. Marcus looked up, relief flickering across his face. He was complaining of chest pain earlier. Now, I can't wake him up. His breathing seems shallow. A voice cut in from behind them. "I'm a doctor." Tar had noticed the commotion and hurried back from first class. "May I?" Marcus stepped aside. Maya watched as Tar quickly checked the man's pulse, then his pupils. His voice was calm but urgent. "We need to lay him flat. Does the plane have a medical kit and an AED?" "Yes. I'll get them right away." Marcus dashed toward the front. Tar turned back to the unconscious passenger. "Sir, can you hear me?" His fingers pressed firmly against the man's carotid artery. The elderly man's eyes flickered open for a brief second, then rolled back. His skin was turning an alarming shade of gray. "I think he's having a heart attack," Tar murmured. "Can you help me move him to the aisle?" Together, they carefully shifted the man onto the floor. Around them, passengers stirred, watching nervously. "Does anyone know this man?" Maya asked. A woman across the aisle spoke up. "His name is Walter Simmons. He told me he was on his way to his granddaughter's wedding in Atlanta." Marcus returned with the AED. As Tar worked quickly, Maya became aware of someone standing nearby. Richard Whitfield, watching the scene intently, his face unreadable. Maya glanced up. "Is there something we can help you with, sir?" Richard's voice was quiet. "I know that man.